August 18, 1944. Just past 2200 hours, the Luzon Strait is a black throat of ocean, funneling ships between Taiwan and the northern tip of the Philippines, where currents shear the surface and the wind carries the smell of rain. Far to the north, Japan's fleet is running on the last inches of the gauge. Fuel comes from the south, Borneo, Sumatra, the refineries at Singapore and Brunei, then pushes north along a hard, predictable artery. Singapore to Formosa, Formosa to the home islands, always through this narrow slot of sea. Every destroyer sweep, every pilot's training hour, every carrier deck cycle is chained to tankers slipping through the night. You can feel that chain pull here, at the pinch point. The convoy in the dark carries that weight. Chai convoys are the fast ones, oil and high-value cargo under the care of K-Boken escorts and destroyers, running harder than the slow freighter packs, trying to beat the odds with speed and discipline. On paper, it looks safe. Layered lookouts, zigzag plans, placards of depth charge patterns thumbtacked in wardrooms. In practice, late 1944 feels different. Radar sets don't all agree. Some escorts still nurse older sonar. Air cover arrives thinner and farther apart. And the radio net is a stitched quilt of doctrine, habit, and fatigue. It isn't that the men are careless. It's that the enemy has grown sharper in the time it took to cross a season. Northbound, the tanker columns hold a steady 12 knots, a compromise between caution and hope. On the bridges, officers squint into wind-shredded cloud, the moon sometimes a smudge, sometimes gone. The sea is alive with small things, whitecaps, short squalls, the shine of oil film where pumps and valves leak the way all ships leak. In the spaces below, boiler rooms throb, and in the escort CICs, the red light makes every face look older. On the curtained radio benches, men click pencils and trace bearings, keeping the geometry of survival in their heads, formation spacing, turn timing, the danger of a broken line. Japan's war has tilted into arithmetic. Pilots count training hours like coins, watching the ledger of fuel burn and replacement. Destroyers cradle their tanks, running at economical speed and hating themselves for it. Big ships have been pushed south toward the oil to shorten the pipeline, but that only makes the line to the home islands thinner and longer elsewhere. The Navy is breathing through a straw, and tonight that straw crosses this strait. Somewhere out ahead, no one on the convoy can see it yet. American submarines move like low, hard shadows, spread across the likely track. They have learned the narrow places and the night. After a year of fixing the torpedoes that used to lie or quit, the boats come in teams, 3 and 4 together, passing contacts, slicing the ocean into lanes and ambush angles. Their surface search radar quietly paints rectangles of steel against the weather. Their bridges stay low against the swells, spray breaking white over black. The ocean teaches you a rhythm, and by late 1944, the U.S. boats drum to it. Find, trail, divide, and hit where the line bends. This is the part of the story you can feel in your chest. An empire of steel and doctrine, reduced to the luck of a night passage and the sharpness of a few men peering at scopes. A tanker is not a flagship, but it is a heartbeat. One night that takes away enough of them changes the sound of the whole body. If you're enjoying these hidden lever stories of the Pacific War, hit subscribe to Warpath so you don't miss the next chapter in this chain. The convoy's name, the painted hull numbers, the careful cargo lists, all of that is supposed to bring certainty. But certainty hates weather. And it doesn't much like narrow straits either. The escorts zig on schedule, zag on the half-minute, propellers churning a repeating pattern into the dark. The doctrine says it helps. The sonar says it throws false echoes. The men say it keeps them busy enough to forget what they can't control. In the wake of each tanker, the water slicks a little, and the smell of refined fuel rides the wind. It is a smell every submariner learns to love. Out on the picket line, the first contact is not dramatic. A dot appears on a greenish screen and becomes 2, then a trail. Bearings creep. Range ticks down. A captain in a dim conning tower tastes salt and considers whether the convoy is running what his notebook says it should run. 12 knots, maybe 14 if they're anxious. The outer screen thin in the squalls. He thinks about where to be when the line changes direction, not where it is. On an escort, a radar operator rubs his eyes and asks for a second sweep, because the new return doesn't look like weather, and weather is all he'd seen for 20 minutes. In the convoy flagship CIC, a junior officer tightens his fist around a grease pencil and feels a private surge of dread he cannot name. The sea state rises and falls like a breath. In the tanker's crew spaces, men lie in their bunks and feel the pitch tell them they're making time. On the subs, men sit on their hands to keep from fidgeting with the TDC dials. On the escorts, lookouts lean until their eyes ache. Minutes slide. The geometry of closing accelerates the way it always does at night, invisibly, then all at once. Some stories begin with bangs and flares. This one begins with a formation moving blind into a line of watchers who won't announce themselves until it hurts. Out ahead, an American skipper measures wind and wakes and distance to a point on the ocean he can only see in his mind. Inside the convoy, a watch officer makes a small correction to hold station. On the escort flagship, a voice in the CIC says, "Repeat that last," because the scope is showing something not quite like anything he saw yesterday, and because the night is changing shape. They call it an escort, but it feels more like a nervous system stretched thin across the dark. On the outer ring ride, the Kaiboken, compact escorts built for anti-submarine work, shoulders hunched into the wind, crews drilled hard on zigzag discipline and depth charge patterns. Inside them, destroyers sit like tight springs, engines ready to leap. The convoy commander sees it as a grid, columns of oilers and transports, the valuables, all marching north beneath a ceiling of cloud that keeps land-based patrol planes on a shorter leash. On some bridges, the sets are newer, surface search radar with a steadier picture. On others, the green sweep drifts, the gain up, the returns fuzzed by squall lines. Sonar men listen into their cups and hear more ocean than steel. This week's run has weight to it. More than 24 hulls, most of the tonnage that matters liquid. The oil that moves pilots from student to combat ready, that turns a destroyer division from paper to teeth, that lets a carrier cycle strikes and recoveries without counting the minutes like pennies. The route is the old artery, up from Singapore and Miri through the South China Sea, past the Palawan Passage and toward Formosa's southern shoulder, then through the Bashi Channel where the sea narrows and decisions accelerate. They've made this trip before. That familiarity is both comfort and trap. The air cover today is a rumor threaded through the radio net. Available when the ceiling lifts, maybe delayed, maybe lower on fuel than anyone likes to say. In the red-lit combat information centers, officers keep a board in their heads as much as on the wall. Formation spacing, turn timing, estimates of what the boats out there can do. A zig every 7 minutes, a zag every 6. Speed steady at 12 knots unless the Commodore says otherwise. If weather thickens, close up a little. If radar flickers, trust the men on the wings and their eyes that ache. Out past the lane, American submarines track the convoy by geometry and habit. They have learned to cover the approaches like a net. One boat high, one low, one to the east, one to the west, sharing bearings, ranges, and guesses about convoy doctrine. Comms are curt, timed, and sparse. Brief radio flickers at prearranged minutes so no one stays lit. Their captains work backward from what the convoy must do, not what it is doing now. At 12 knots with a zig every 7, where will that center column be in 40 minutes if the wind holds south-southwest and they're keeping station? The math is simple. The ocean is not. Boats with names the war will remember slide into position. Rasher, a hunter with a knack for picking out the most valuable silhouettes. Bluefish, wide awake in the weather, keeping a patient trail. Spadefish, new to the ocean, but already fluent in the grammar of the night surface attack. There are others spread along the likely track, each with an opinion about where the line will bend and how close the escorts will cling when the formation turns. Their surface search radar does what human eyes cannot. A good operator can tell a convoy from weather by the way returns stack and split, how the picture breathes as columns ripple in the swell. On Rasher's bridge, the captain stands forward of the shears, water beating on his face, counting seconds between radar sweeps and the rise of the bow. He thinks in spreads, not single shots, and he thinks in angles. What angle on the bow will close fastest if the convoy zigs now, and how much he can trust a textbook zig when the sky looks like this. Below, the TDC hums with life. men feeding it ranges and bearings and speed estimates, hands steady because they've done this in training and once or twice where it mattered, and this one is going to matter more. In the convoy, doctrine insists on order. The columns hold their spacing. The outer escorts sweep and double back on arcs meant to scare an attacker into diving early. The destroyers reserve their speed like a secret. Yet order frays against weather, and it frays against nerves. A squall shoves the portside column half a cable inward. A radar set on an escort builds a phantom echo on the edge of the scope that won't cleanly resolve. A signalman misreads a blinked lamp through rain and corrects it a beat later. No harm done. Nothing anyone would write down, but the little hesitations add up. The sea writes its own rules under cloud. Moonlight, when it leaks, makes a dark surface look like metal. Rain stripes fall in a race. Wind shifts shove exhaust across decks and lay a faint smell of fuel down the line. On the tankers, men smoke behind cupped hands and talk about the run in quick, low-colored sentences, the way men do when there's nothing to do but wait. On the escort sonar, the ocean is a crash of beads across a taut skin. A trained ear hunts for the hard, regular tick of screws in that static. Sometimes it's there and vanishes. Sometimes it's nothing, and they have to pretend it was something so they can sleep later. The American boats mean to keep this on the surface as long as they can. At night, on the waterline, they're jagged and low and fast, harder to see, quicker to reposition. Submerged, they're slow and half-blind, and the escort's ping can pin them to a place. So they stalk in the dark, engines throttled just enough to keep pace, trusting their radar and the pattern of the convoy's breath. If the convoy zigs on schedule, the fat part of the column will cross an invisible point in 20 minutes. If the escorts are busy on the far beam, the near beam opens a seam. If the moon stays behind cloud, the approach will be a shadow inside a shadow. Near midnight, bearings begin to drift, the way a tide pulls at a boat tied to a pier. Little shifts become trends. Trends become commitments. A submarine captain decides to cut inside and backhand the line when it swings. An escort commander decides to shorten a sweep and stay closer to the column because a radar echo out there won't behave. On the convoy flagship, a senior officer runs a fingertip along the charted track and feels the old comfort of ink and paper, and the new discomfort of how little that means when the night develops a will of its own. A few more minutes, and the clock will jump. Men on both sides don't know it yet, in the way you don't know a summer storm is about to break until the first air goes cold against your skin. A spread waits in a tube. A depth charge pattern sits ready in racks. Engines thrum, the formation moves. The line of watchers tightens, and somewhere just ahead, the first solution settles enough to risk everything on it. Just after 2300 on August 18th, 1944, the first contact hardens into shape. The convoy is angling north-northeast across the Bashi Channel, speed about 12 knots, columns tight enough that wakes braid together and then unbraid in the swell. A squall slides off the starboard beam, and the escorts pinch inward for a minute, then relax. Far out on the near bow, a submarine captain checks the wind on his cheek and calls for another bearing. The radar return is breathing, fat, thin, fat, exactly the way a convoy breathes when it zigzags on the clock. Midnight approaches and the geometry snaps into place. On one of the American boats, the captain lifts his voice just enough for the bridge to hear him over the wind. This is it. Steady, steady. Below, the torpedo data computer hums and men work by touch. Spreads are set to run under the fat targets, the ones whose silhouettes sit high when the moon leaks through, the ones that shine a little with the sheen that means refined fuel. On another boat, a lookout murmurs, almost to himself, "That long deck looks wrong for a freighter," because out there, tucked into the line of tankers and transports, rides a broader, squarer shadow, an escort carrier being used as convoy shield and ferry. Just past midnight, the first spread leaps. Tubes belch, the boat heels, and the captain's hand stays open on the bridge rail as if willing the geometry to hold. A few heartbeats, then the ocean answers. A deep-throated steel-on-steel thud that doesn't sound like a near miss. Then a second, closer, followed by a thready rising roar as something large takes fire. Across the convoy, officers jolt to the sound, and in one CIC, a junior man blurts, "Hit!" before catching himself. On the American's bridge, a quartermaster grins without meaning to, because even trained restraint isn't strong enough to hold the first surge of relief. Within minutes, a new track slides into the kill zone from another angle. Coordination is curt and quiet, little more than a time mark and a bearing, because no one wants to light the ether any longer than necessary. The second boat chooses a different slice of the formation and sends fish high and fast. One of the torpedoes blows under a ship whose decks sit low and long. The column hiccups. Escorts whip their sterns around and begin laying patterns behind the bubbles they think they saw. "Take her down," an American skipper says, and the bow dips, the bridge ducks, and the night becomes sound and vibration. Depth charges walk down the slope of water overhead, each one a fist of pressure that slaps the hull and then spends itself. "Hold her at 200 feet. The helmsman answers in a voice he keeps calm by force. Up top, where the moon opens and then closes like a wound, the convoy loses the beat. The carrier, sources will differ on how quickly she went, some saying she rolled early, others that she burned a while before the hull let go, slides out of formation and vanishes into smoke and black water. A big oiler aft of her takes one in the midships and begins to pour flame, the glow marking the line for miles. Men on nearby tankers feel the heat on their faces and start throwing hoses and foam the way training taught them. But you can't train the air to be breathable while oil burns. A boatswain's voice cracks as he orders his section to the rails to clear rafts. On one bridge, an officer clutches a speaking tube and hears himself say, "All engines ahead, keep station," knowing in his stomach that station no longer exists. The escorts work hard and angry. Patterns go in, wide then tight, then back to wide to catch a boat that might be circling. Sonar sings and lies by turns. Rain makes its own kind of noise. Now and then, a ping hardens and the chief on the stack taps the young operator's shoulder and says, "There, again." Charges go over, the wake boils, and for the length of a breath, you can believe the ocean is emptying of enemies. But the boats are playing the surface game. When a seam opens in the escort sweep, a periscope feather glints for a second and then is gone, too low for a casual eye to catch. Around 0100, another run knifes in, this time aimed at the middle of the tanker column, where the load is richest. Two detonations punch the night almost together, then a third that sounds wrong, hollow and flat. And if you've been at sea, you know that's the noise a ship makes when her back breaks. Oil slicks out in sheets and the smell gets inside every mouth. In the radio net, men talk over each other until the flagship's voice snaps them down to order. "Screen to port, tighten," someone says, and a Kaiboken swings too hard, stabs at a shadow, and loses her own place in the geometry. "We're going to lose the formation," a destroyer skipper says to no one, and then realizes he already has. Below, the American control rooms count seconds between explosions. A torpedo man whispers, "That one was ours," and the exec shakes his head and says nothing because he can't know and because it doesn't matter. What matters is the picture on the plot. Icons moving slower, a gap opening where a fat return used to be, an escort lingering too long over angry water and leaving the near beam thin. One boat slides through that thin place like a needle through cloth and sets up for another shot. 2 degrees more right, fire, 3, fire, 4. A moment later, the captain tastes metal and knows a ship somewhere ahead of him is bleeding into the sea. Buys Euro 300, the convoy is not a convoy anymore, but a collection of ships with the same destination and different luck. Some huddle near the escorts, some fall off to nurse wounds. A few, those with captains who think speed is life, edge away into the dark and bet that outrunning fate is better than hiding from it. The rain comes in hard bands now, then eases, then comes again. A raft slides down a tanker's side with 6 men in it, and an oiled, exhausted seventh hangs from the line until a hand smashes his fingers flat and he lets go into the next wave. In one CIC, a lieutenant draws a box where a ship should be and then scrubs it out with the heel of his hand. "We're missing 2 from column 2, someone says. 3, says another, softer. On a submarine, the captain finally gives the order he's been holding back because there's a limit to luck. Down for depth charges. We've been greedy enough. The hull creaks as the boat slides under the layer. The ocean closes over their wake, and the last of the burning light disappears. Dawn takes a long time to arrive. When it does, the water shows what the night wrote. Soot on the horizon, a smear of oil to the west, a wrecked lifeboat turning end over end in the swell. The remaining ships pull themselves together into something like order and make a slow, sober knot toward the next waypoint. The escorts watch their scopes and pretend to trust them. Far astern, the sea keeps its own counsel. Somewhere below it, men listen for pings that don't come. And think about the next point on the chart where the line can be bent into another ambush. At first light, the arithmetic begins. Escort officers squint across a gray swell and start to count, one column at a time, and the numbers don't land where yesterday's plan says they should. Smoke hangs low where a ship went down burning. A sheen spreads where a tanker bled out. A lifeboat rides too high for the number of men in it. The flagship's wireless hums with clipped voices trying to piece a picture from fragments, and someone has to put a pencil to a logbook and write a thing no one wants to own. Ships missing, tonnage gone, fuel denied. What does that mean in the language that matters? It means days and weeks, not just hours. A convoy like this carries the kind of weight that changes calendars. In round numbers, sources differ because the sea swallows receipts. Tens of thousands of gross registered tons vanish in a single night, likely on the order of 60 to 100,000, counting the big hulls and the smaller ones that don't make headlines. When tankers are part of that number, you don't only lose steel, you lose the barrels they would have put into storage tanks in the home islands, barrels that would have been broken into aviation fuel and bunker fuel, and the 1,000 small streams of kerosene and lube that keep a Navy feeling alive. Translate that into the fluid everyone is actually counting, hundreds of thousands of barrels not arriving on time, some never arriving at all. It's tempting to imagine that loss is a single punch, dramatic and over. But the truth is quieter and meaner. The pipeline from Singapore and Brunei northward is long and thin, and every missing ship leaves a hollow that takes months to fill, even if you have the hulls. And by late 1944, Japan doesn't. Before the summer, monthly oil arrivals can still look like a heartbeat, weakening but regular. After nights like this, the line on the chart droops, then sags, then stays low. Depending on which set of figures you trust, deliveries plunge by half or more compared to early 1944, and the mix skews wrong. Too little aviation gasoline, too little of the clean fractions that fighter groups and carrier decks crave. On paper, you can move fuel between accounts. In the real world, you cannot turn heavy oil into flight hours. Watch how that plays out on a Tuesday afternoon, far from the Luzon Strait. A training field north of Tokyo throttles back its syllabus. Student pilots fly fewer hours, ride the edge of proficiency, and climb out knowing they won't get the next repetition until someone finds more gas. A destroyer division gets a signal to reduce speed to something a chief engineer calls parade pace, the kind of steaming that conserves fuel and breaks hearts. Capital ships shift their anchorage to Linga Roads in Singapore because it shortens the last leg from refinery to bunker, which is logical and also an admission. The Lifeline is too fragile to keep feeding the beast at home. Staff officers draw plans around what fuel exists, not what doctrine would prefer, and planners begin to speak of operations that husband resources instead of those that project power. Men feel it in their bodies. On a carrier, the deck cycles grow precious. Flight ops compress, then pause, then resume with a caution that has nothing to do with weather. You can taste the difference in the air, less exhaust, more silence between launches, more talk below, about the next replenishment that keeps sliding on the calendar. In destroyer wardrooms, the talk narrows to things you can control, gunnery tables, watch rotations, and studiously avoids the one thing you can't, which is what to do when the next convoy is late or never arrives. In the submarine pen, sketches back at a U.S. forward base, a staff officer puts a small tick next to August and knows, in the pit of his stomach, that a handful of nights like this will do what bombing raids and big surface actions couldn't do alone. Turn a first-rate Navy into a fleet of hulls that can't move when they need to. Strategy shifts under that pressure. Japanese admirals had already pushed major units south in the spring to live closer to fuel. Now that logic ossifies into necessity. The gamble becomes explicit. Keep the fleet alive by feeding it at the source, then fight the decisive battle later when the pipeline recovers. But a pipeline is not a promise. It is a bet against an enemy who has learned to read your routes and place his knives at the narrow parts. And the narrow parts don't move. The Luzon Strait will be where it is tomorrow and the week after and the week after that. The consequences connect forward. In October, when the war converges on the Philippines and the sea around Leyte boils with options and deception, you will see carriers that look right from a distance and feel wrong up close. Fewer planes, greener pilots, fuel budgets that make sortie rates a negotiation with the ledger. The boldness of using a carrier force as bait reads one way in a vacuum, and another way when you remember that a navy which cannot confidently refill its tanks has fewer plays it can run. Surface groups that must fight their way through straits now do so, knowing that every flank speed order is a withdrawal from an account that may not refill. None of this lessens the courage. The men in the Luzon Strait on both sides did everything skill and nerve can do. It's that courage lived inside a system, shrinking by the week. The night HI-71 breaks open is the part of the movie where the score changes key. The eye remembers the burning slick and the suddenly empty spaces in a formation that was full at dusk. The war remembers the quieter thing that followed. Airfields scheduling fewer sorties, shipyards waiting on deliveries that crawled, training commands writing new syllabi that ended sooner. Somewhere an ensign ran a finger down a column of numbers and understood, in a way he would never forget, that the war had tipped from muscle to metabolism. By the time the survivors of the convoy reach safer water, the news has already outrun them. Radios carry it in phrases that aren't meant to frighten and do anyway. In a staff room, a senior officer closes his eyes for a moment and sees a chart that won't be coaxed back into the shape it had yesterday. The fleet will keep moving. It must. But from here on, every mile has to be argued with the tank gauge, and every plan has to be written in the margin where arithmetic meets hope. By the time the sun climbs higher, the night feels like a rumor you could almost dismiss, if not for the oil in the water, the soot that won't stop crawling out of the horizon, and the empty places in the columns where ships should be. Messages move up chains of command in language that tries to be dry and fails. Missing, presumed lost, heavy damage, survivors not yet tallied. The men aboard what's left of the convoy keep watch with a new kind of quiet. They don't know the name historians will give the night, or the shorthand they'll use for the convoy. They only know that the ocean took a hard bite, and that the bite landed where it hurts a navy the most. What broke here wasn't only steel, it was cadence, the beat of fuel that makes everything else possible. To pretend that one night made the crisis is to ignore the way the graph had already bent downward by early 1944. Attrition from months of submarine work, bombers stalking routes from the air, and the slow starvation of an island empire stretch past what its tankers and refineries could serve. But to ignore what HI-71 reveals would be worse. It makes visible, in a single violent set of hours, how thin the Lifeline had become, and how quickly a few sharp cuts could turn a scarcity into a paralysis. You hear it later in how flight schedules are written, how staff officers talk about operations in the language of rationing, how big ships drift closer to the wellhead and call that strategy. If you look for a lesson about heroics, you'll find one. Men on both sides did brave, hard things in conditions that make most people smaller. But the deeper lesson is about how modern wars give victory to whoever masters the invisible plumbing. Kill the pipeline, not just the flagship. The boats that intercepted the convoy didn't win by trading salvos with battleships. They won by understanding that maps are arguments, that straits are stories with only a couple of endings, and that fuel moving through a narrow place is less a target than a system waiting to be collapsed. There's a second lesson, less glamorous and more decisive. The night kill chain is a human machine. It's the quiet choreography of picture building, radar returns sifted, bearings marked, dead reckoning, done in a head against wind and current. It's the discipline to speak briefly over a crowded radio net, and the humility to trust the operator on a scope who sounds too young by the feel in his voice. For the escorts, it was the same, just harder. Older sets fighting weather, sonar lying and telling the truth in the same minute. Orders that work on chalkboards wilting in the rain. None of that reads well in a communique. All of it decides whether ships live. Geography gets a vote that never changes. The Luzon Strait doesn't care who owns the land on either side. It is a throat, and throats are where pressure builds. In August 1944, the pressure was Japan's need to move oil north faster than someone else could sink it. The American answer was to occupy the geometry, lay a line across the track, and wait for the heartbeat to come to you. The convoy's answer was speed, discipline, and hope. That collision is the battle, and the shape of the place turns the dials on fear and courage for everyone in it. The war carries these nights forward in ways that look small on a map and enormous in the lives that live under those maps. A pilot who will fly at Leyte gets fewer practice landings and knows it. A destroyer captain writes into his log that he held his division to 9 knots for a day and feels the shame of it as if it were a confession. A staff planner at a southern anchorage builds a plan on the assumption that the next convoy won't arrive on time and writes the word assumption twice, underlined. If you're tempted to call that fate, remember how much deliberate practice skill went into making it so. The night also teaches about humility and command. Convoy doctrine was not invented to fail. It was the best people could write with the tools at hand. Escort crews worked to exhaustion, and some died in the act of saving strangers whose names they would never learn. Submarine crews courted the most dangerous kind of luck by staying on the surface in weather that could hide them or kill them. The courage feels equal. The systems are not. One side has radar networks that talk to what men can do with them, torpedoes that finally run the depth they're told, and a doctrine that treats finding as the first half of killing. The other has a shrinking pool of fuel to pour into training and technology, and a widening gap between what the paper says and what the night will allow. What happened to HI-71 will be echoed in other places in other wars whenever a nation lives beyond its logistics, pipelines and railheads, straits and passes, grids and nodes. If you cut enough of them in sequence, you don't need to defeat an enemy's finest ships in open water. You make those ships late or idle or hollow, then you win whatever kind of battle they can still bring. That's not the story we grow up wanting, and that's maybe why it hits so hard when you see it play out on black water under bad weather, with men trying to hold station in a world that will not stop moving. There is a final image worth keeping. It is not the explosion itself, not the frame that makes the newsreel. It is the orange wash of burning fuel flowing out and thinning to a jaundiced slick, then fading under the morning's chop. The surviving ships make their slow way, and somewhere beyond the bend in the strait, another convoy is already out of a harbor, trusting to doctrine and speed, watched by men who have learned the rhythm of this route and are patient. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a carrier's deck looks clean and empty and waits for planes that won't launch as often, and the silence between launches feels like a new kind of weather. The content of this video was compiled from multiple sources. If anything is inaccurate or needs correction, please leave a comment below. See you next time.